Green Card Alert. USCIS launches new asset audit for I-485. The letter didn't come by email. It didn't come through your attorney's portal or your online USCIS account dashboard. It came in the mail, thick paper, official seal. And the moment you pulled it out of the envelope, the words at the top stopped you cold. Request for evidence. But this one wasn't about your medical exam. It wasn't about your fingerprints or your passport photo or a missing signature on page 3. This one was asking about your money, your bank accounts, your assets, your financial history going back years, your sponsor's income, your sponsor's tax records, whether the financial support promised in your affidavit of support was real, or whether USCIS had reason to believe it wasn't. This is the new pressure point in the I-485 process, and it is catching applicants completely off guard. Because for years, the financial review portion of a green card application was treated as a formality. You submitted Form I-864. You attached a tax return or two. You moved on. Officers rarely pushed back unless the numbers were dramatically below the poverty guidelines. That era is over. USCIS has quietly shifted its posture on financial documentation. What was once a checkbox is now a scrutiny point. What was once a glance is now an audit. And what was once accepted without question is now triggering RFEs, additional evidence requests, and in some cases, direct questioning at adjustment of status interviews. Most people who receive this kind of RFE panic. They pull out whatever documents they have. They submit them in a rush. They miss what USCIS is actually asking for. They fall straight into the trap. But today, you're going to do something different. For months now, there had been quiet signals. Not from official USCIS press releases, not from formal policy memos posted to the Federal Register, just signals that USCIS was preparing to intensify its review of financial documentation in I-485 cases. Immigration attorneys were seeing it in their caseloads. Paralegals were noting it in RFE language. Case managers were tracking it in the specific pages USCIS was flagging. USCIS has always been thorough, yes, but also variable in how it applies that thoroughness. Some offices were stringent, others were lenient. The financial review portion of the I-485 package was one of the most inconsistently handled components across different field offices and service centers. But what started shifting this year was that the inconsistency disappeared. The scrutiny became uniform. It became systematic, and it began targeting a specific document that most applicants treat as background noise in their filing package. Form I-864, the Affidavit of Support. Immigration attorneys who monitor USCIS RFE trends started documenting the pattern, the increased frequency of financial follow-up requests, the specific language asking for evidence of assets, not just income, the requests for bank statements covering 12 to 24 months, the follow-up questions about joint sponsors and household members, the sudden interest in whether the petitioning sponsor's income was the same income actually available to support the intending immigrant. And when USCIS starts asking those questions with that level of detail, something larger is driving it. Earlier this year, practitioners across multiple states began reporting what they described as a coordinated shift in how USCIS adjudicators were evaluating financial support documentation, including specific requests for asset verification not commonly seen in standard I-485 adjudication cycles. This is behavior USCIS adopts when policy guidance has changed at the adjudication level, when training has been updated for officers reviewing financial documentation, or when enforcement priorities have shifted toward ensuring that newly approved green card holders will not become a public charge within the first years of their permanent residence. There are a few interpretations circulating in the immigration law community. Either USCIS updated its internal training for I-864 review, and officers are applying new scrutiny standards, or the public charge rule framework, which has been in legal and policy flux for several years, has resurfaced in a practical enforcement form, even without a formal regulatory announcement. Or USCIS is responding to broader executive branch pressure to ensure financial accountability in the green card approval pipeline. Observers weren't certain which interpretation was driving it, or whether all three were happening simultaneously. But one thing was clear. USCIS was treating the financial component of I-485 adjudication as a serious gatekeeping function, not a formality. And when USCIS begins treating a previously routine component as a gating mechanism, the consequences for unprepared applicants are immediate. The RFEs being issued in these cases are not routine. They are not symbolic gestures from an adjudicating officer looking to close a small gap in a file. They are structured, specific, and demanding. Attorney after attorney reviewing these notices has described them in consistent terms, surgical in what they ask for, aggressive in their timelines, and critical in one specific way. They require applicants to prove not just that income exists, but that the income is stable, accessible, and genuinely available to support the household. That distinction matters enormously. USCIS is not simply asking whether your sponsor earns above 125% of the federal poverty guideline. It is asking whether that income is reliable, whether it comes from documented, verifiable sources, whether the tax return matches the employment verification letter, whether the bank statements reflect the income pattern that the tax return describes, whether there are gaps, inconsistencies, or red flags that suggest the income figure submitted is aspirational rather than real. If the financial picture doesn't add up across all those documents in combination, USCIS is now issuing RFEs asking for more. And if the response to the RFE doesn't close the gap, the case can stall or face a request for an in-person interview where an officer will ask questions directly. Strategy only works for the applicant when they understand exactly what USCIS is measuring. Those who submit a tax return and assume that closes the issue are not prepared for what's coming. USCIS policy on Form I-864 has always required that the sponsor demonstrate the means to maintain the intending immigrant at or above 125% of the federal poverty level. For a household of two in 2025, that threshold sits above $22,000 annually. For larger households, the threshold rises proportionally. But the recent wave of RFEs is targeting something beyond just the income number. USCIS is now specifically requesting evidence of assets when income alone appears insufficient or when income appears inconsistent across documents. Here is what that means in practice. If your sponsor is self-employed and their income fluctuates year to year, USCIS may ask for multiple years of tax returns, plus a current profit and loss statement, plus bank statements to establish a pattern. If your sponsor recently changed jobs, USCIS may ask for a letter from the new employer, plus recent pay stubs to verify current earnings match what was reported. If your sponsor's income is close to the threshold, not dramatically below, just close, USCIS may now ask whether assets exist that can bridge any gap. Assets in the context of I-864 include bank accounts, investment accounts, real property equity, and certain other holdings. The formula USCIS uses to count assets toward the income requirement is specific. For most family-based cases, only 1/5 of the asset value counts toward the shortfall. So if a sponsor's income is $10,000 below the threshold, they need to show $50,000 in assets to make up the difference. Most applicants and even some petitioners have no idea this formula exists. They assume income is income and that's the end of it. That assumption is now producing RFEs at a rate that immigration attorneys describe as significantly elevated compared to prior years. Let me break down the 3 most common failure patterns showing up in these financial RFEs right now. The first pattern is the income to tax return mismatch. An applicant submits an I-864 showing current income of $60,000 per year. The most recent tax return on file shows $41,000. USCIS sends an RFE asking the sponsor to explain the discrepancy and provide verification of current earnings. If the sponsor changed jobs, got a raise, or started earning more recently, that explanation needs to be documented clearly. A letter from the employer is not enough. It needs to be accompanied by recent pay stubs that corroborate the figure. Without that corroboration, USCIS will not simply accept the higher number. The second pattern is the joint sponsor gap. Many I-485 applicants rely on a joint sponsor to meet the income threshold. The petitioning spouse earns below the guideline, so a parent, sibling, or friend agrees to co-sponsor. USCIS is now more carefully evaluating whether the joint sponsor's commitment is credible and whether their household income is genuinely available to support the intending immigrant as a legal obligation. RFEs in this category often ask for additional tax years, documentation of the joint sponsor's own household obligations, and clarification of the relationship between the joint sponsor and the applicant. The third pattern, and this is the one that generates the most confusion, is the self-employed sponsor. When a sponsor is self-employed, their income is reported on Schedule C of their federal tax return. Schedule C income can vary significantly from year to year. USCIS is now specifically requesting multiple years of Schedule C filings, business bank statements, and in some cases, a current year-to-date profit and loss statement prepared by a CPA. If those documents aren't consistent with each other, the RFE escalates into a broader financial scrutiny review. All three of these patterns have one thing in common. The applicant submitted the original I-864 package without knowing that USCIS would look this closely. They submitted what they had. They assumed it was enough. They moved on. Now USCIS is asking them to go back and do it right. There is also a critical timing element to this situation that deserves your attention. Many of the I-485 cases now receiving financial RFEs were filed 1, 2, or even 3 years ago. The income information on the original I-864 reflects what the sponsor earned at the time of filing. But by the time USCIS gets around to adjudicating the case, the sponsor may have changed jobs, changed income levels, or changed their household composition. USCIS officers reviewing a case today are looking at documents from years ago. And if those documents reflect a financial picture that no longer matches current reality, in either direction, the officer may request updated financial documentation before proceeding. This means that even if your original I-864 was perfectly compliant when you filed it, you may need to submit an updated I-864 with current tax returns and current income verification before your case can be approved. Your attorney should be monitoring this proactively. If your case has been pending for more than 12 months, ask specifically whether your financial documentation should be refreshed before USCIS reaches your file. Here is the protocol that immigration attorneys are now recommending for anyone with a pending I-485 who has not yet received an RFE. Pull your original I-864 package and review every piece of financial documentation submitted. Check whether the income figure on the I-864 is supported by the tax returns attached. Check whether the tax returns are the most recent available. Check whether pay stubs or employment letters in the package are still current. If more than 12 months have passed since filing, and especially if the sponsor has changed employment, income level, or household size, consider proactively submitting an updated I-864 with current documentation before USCIS requests it. If you relied on a joint sponsor, confirm that the joint sponsor is still willing and financially able to maintain the legal obligation. Joint sponsor situations can change over years. The person may have retired, changed income, or experienced financial hardship. An RFE that reveals the joint sponsor is no longer viable can be devastating. If your sponsor is self-employed, work with a CPA now to prepare a current profit and loss statement even before USCIS asks for one. Having it ready means you can respond to an RFE quickly, rather than scrambling to find an accountant in week 3 of an 87-day window. And if you have received the RFE already, read it with precision. Identify every single document USCIS is requesting. Do not submit a partial response. Do not assume that providing income documentation alone will satisfy a request that also asked for asset documentation. USCIS is not required to give you a second chance if your first response fails to address every element of the RFE. The broader lesson in all of this is one that applies across the entire I-485 process. USCIS has a mandate. It has legal authority to verify that every person approved for permanent residence meets all the requirements at the time of adjudication, not just at the time of filing. The years-long backlog has created a situation where adjudication happens long after filing, and the legal requirements don't pause during that gap. The burden on the applicant is continuous, not one time, not satisfied by a well-organized filing package submitted years ago. Continuous. That means staying informed. That means monitoring your case. That means understanding that new policy guidance, updated scrutiny standards, and shifting enforcement priorities can affect your case even if you are still waiting and have done nothing wrong. Knowing this is not a sign of guilt. It is not a sign of weakness in your application. It is the only rational response to a system that is complex, slow, and unforgiving of gaps. Knowing this makes you prepared. It means you can see the financial RFE coming before it arrives. It means you can act before USCIS sends the envelope instead of reacting after the deadline clock has already started. As USCIS continues to intensify its review of I-485 financial documentation, more applicants will be affected. More sponsors will receive calls from their family members saying the green card package they filed 2 years ago just generated a new evidence request. More people who were told they were close to approval will find themselves rebuilding their financial documentation from scratch. But the ones who come through this cleanly are the ones who were watching. Share this video with everyone in your household who has a pending I-485. Share it with your community. Share it with any family member whose sponsor needs to understand what USCIS is now looking for. Subscribe to Visa Status Radar for more protection. We protect you with real information as the next phase of this process unfolds.